Okay, this is chapter 2, part 3. Is the social world objective or constructed by us? So here we see another division that kind of, again, comes from philosophy of what's the best way to learn about our world and study it. So according to those who hold an objectivist ontology, social forces are external to us and push and pull us in different directions. So again, some fancy terms here. Objectivist, by objectivist, they mean sort of outside of people. And ontology, a fancy word that comes from philosophy. We can break that into two parts. Remember that ology refers to the study of, and that onto part there refers to, like, what is reality, what exists. And so it's the study kind of what's real, study of reality. And so objectivist ontology would be the study of reality, or taking the view of reality that it's outside of us and it kind of pushes and pulls us in different directions. Those with a constructivist ontology, on the other hand, it's the contrast here, believe that we quote unquote, build up the social world as we interact with each other. So it's this idea that society, that this world that we live in, the social world anyway, that it's not really outside of us, pushing on us, pulling us, as if, the objectivist ontology is almost like that people are pawns on a chessboard, pieces on a chessboard, and you get pushed around, and where you end up on the chessboard is because somebody moved you there. Something outside of you is pushing you around the board. This constructivist ontology, it sees us as more it focuses a lot on our interacting with each other, talking to each other, interacting with people, and that what happens to people depends a lot on sort of our active participation and our actions. Our actions make stuff real, and the focus is on actions, not on outside things pushing and pulling you around. So society, the more or less focus on understanding people is more what their actions are and interactions are that build up this thing that we call the social world or society. So one thing, and I believe, if I recall, the textbook doesn't talk about this, a limitation of these approaches, both of these, is that both of them are very social. They see the world as made up of almost like minds that don't have bodies, almost the minds that are interacting with each other, or communicating with each other, or maybe minds that are getting pushed and pulled around by things, but still the focus is on minds. And something that's missing from both approaches is that they tend to downplay or ignore the fact that humans are not just minds or people, minds, beings that communicate with each other and interact and influence others, but we're physical organisms. We're creatures. If you take that positivistic point of view, that we're a species of animals, a certain type of primate, well, and that we're influenced by physical things, by the way our brain functions, by the way we're put together, the way our bodies work, our hormones, and neurotransmitters in the brain, and all of these physical things, that we're physical organisms, and that those things have to be taken into account to understand fully what humans are like. So that would be a criticism of both of these approaches, is that it's not just social stuff, either on the inside or the outside, but it's also physical and biological things pushing and pulling people as well. Research strategy, quantitative versus qualitative. Okay, a useful way of classifying the two major methods that we use in the social sciences, especially sociology and related fields, is this qualitative. And these strategies are different. You see here these different, they lay out and introduce these first, but it's best way to approach it is just to get into the specifics of it, and then you'll see these different strategies, how these strategies are different. Let's move forward through this slide to the next one. Quantitative research, let's focus on that one first. And so again, we talked already about how quantitative, to keep it real simple, refers to research that focuses on numbers. So you're measuring things, whatever it is you're studying, say crime. I'll probably fall back on this example a lot in the semester because it's kind of what I do. If you're measuring, you'll measure crime and try to figure out some way to measure it in a quantitative way with numbers. So, how many times have you gotten arrested in the past 12 months, in the past year? See, that would be an example of a quantitative approach where you're coming up with a number that measures whatever it is that you're interested in learning more about. Typically with a quantitative approach, you get methods like experiments tend to be very quantitative, and you don't really see a lot of experiments in sociology and criminology. You see that a lot more in psychology. We're more likely in sociology, criminology, social work to use surveys to ask people things, ask people questions, and then take their answers and come up with a number for their answers. So on that question of, how many times you've been arrested in the past 12 months? If your answer is 0, then we give you a 0 for that. And if it's 1 time, you get a 1. And if it's 2 times in the past year you've been arrested, you get a 2. So see, we took your answer and came up with a number for it, and it would be a number that you would put into a spreadsheet, into data, quantitative software that you would use to analyze statistically. So quantitative research is about numbers, it's about statistics, it's about analyzing statistics. That's why we require you to take these statistics courses. That's a big part of what we do in the social sciences, is to gather and analyze statistical data to understand people better. This sort of quantitative approach tends to take a deductive approach to research, again, as we talked about before, where you take a theory, come up with the data, and then see if that data supports the theory or not. So we test theories with data. That's a deductive approach. It tends to be with quantitative research. And then also you tend to get this positivist epistemology, where it's a straightforward scientific method approach. We're going to use the methods of science, which tend to be quantitative, which tend to focus on numbers, and we're going to and statistics, and we're going to study humans just like we do everything else. And then also this approach tends to be objectivist, meaning that we look at things that are outside of a person's free will or their understanding, their minds, their rational minds, possibly looking outside of those things that could push and pull you in different directions. So a quantitative approach might look at something like the gang, that the reason why you become a criminal is there's this gang that you fall into, and these people all around you that are influencing, pushing and pulling you in different behavior in different ways and convincing you to commit crimes and that kind of stuff. These are things outside of yourself that are pushing and pulling you. In this case, that would be a gang. So that's an objectivist view, that there's outside pressures pulling you in different directions, right? That's quantitative research. Now, we see here a table that breaks up quantitative into qualitative, and so it just sort of summarizes what I just said. Deductive takes a scientific approach, takes this objectivist approach for quantitative, and then you see qualitative over here, which is the contrast, the other side. Let's go ahead to another slide to get more of that. For qualitative research, there's a greater focus on trying to understand the subjective meanings held by actors. Again, this interpretivist epistemology that we talked about before, that Verstehen that Max Weber was talking about. If you want to understand human beings, it's not enough to look at the outside and to reduce everything to numbers, that you're going to have to get inside people's heads by asking them, what they think about things and how they understand things. And so it's a lot of focus on people's understanding of things and asking them about those. And so because of that, you can't rely on just surveys or collecting numbers on people. You have to do you have to do interviews where you sit down and talk to people for a lengthy period of time, an hour, 2 hours, something like that. Maybe you hang out with them for a period of days or weeks on and off to get to really know them kind of inside and out. And so the approach is more intensive that way. You see this term ethnography that we'll talk about later in the semester, but just so you know what we're referring to, this is an approach, tends to be a qualitative type approach where you spend a lot of time hanging out with people, socializing with people, spending time with them day after day, and trying to understand them through spending a lot of time with them, talking to them a lot, listening to them a lot, asking them a lot of questions over an extended period of time. So, and maybe living in where they live. And this is an approach that's often used by anthropologists who will go to some exotic, society, a tribe that lives, say, in the Amazon rainforest or something, and you go live there for 6 months and try to understand where these people are coming from, their culture, and to get in their minds on how they see the world and understand things, right? That's what we mean when we say ethnography. So with a qualitative approach, the focus is on words, not on numbers. So we use where we write, so it's not like statistical analysis. You write up notes and you write up conclusions, and it's all word based. And so you could also do things like analyze newspapers, or you could analyze TV shows or TV news programs or movies, that kind of thing, and analyze, try to pick up the meanings and understandings and themes that come up in this sort of media content. So that's another way of doing research that can be a qualitative approach, is again, you're focusing on interpretations and words and understandings of things as opposed to numbers. The approach tends to be inductive, meaning that you're more likely with this sort of research to go in and start getting to know people, or starting to collect data, write down notes of what you're seeing, and keeping very thorough notes of what you're seeing, and beginning to form the beginnings of a theory as you're collecting this data. And so, but you start out sort of, naive, sort of, where you're just open and like a sponge, absorbing everything that you're seeing and trying to learn from that. So the idea is that eventually the theory will emerge from all of this data, all of these people that you're talking to, or whatever it is that you're focusing on, all of these TV programs or advertisements that you're watching, to see what's going on there and learn from those by observing lots of them. And there's a tendency with this qualitative approach to take more of the social constructionist ontology, that interpretivist ontology, where you're focusing on understanding people by talking to them a lot, and this idea that, well, let's not focus on outside things like the gang that are pushing and pulling people around, but instead let's get inside people's minds and see how they looking at them as active individuals who are interacting with other people, and how they're interacting with other people. Sort of, you're building up, quote unquote, society from how people are dealing and interacting and talking and communicating with other people. So again, it's the idea that kind of society's coming from the inside, as opposed to you being the pawn on that chessboard getting pushed and pulled in different directions. So again, these things don't all have to go together, but there's a tendency in the research to be either kind of qualitative or to be quantitative. That's the tendency. Now, you see on this next slide that you do see what's called a mixed methods approach, where you're mixing together the numbers and the words. You have some quantitative analysis with some of the statistics and the numbers, but then you also have this qualitative approach, which is focusing on the words and the meanings and understandings, all that kind of stuff. And so you're trying to get best of both worlds here. Now, I'm not going to go into any more detail on this right now, because again, it's just a mix. It's a mix of the two things we've already talked about. So I don't need to spend a lot of time on that, but it's just kind of trying to draw on the strong points of both the quantitative and also the qualitative ways of doing research. So now, one thing that we have to keep in mind about about research is that it's a human thing. We're all trying to be scientific, or we're all trying to get to the truth, but when any researcher is going to bring his or her values and perspectives and even bias and they're just their own viewpoint into anything that they do. And that it can be seen as a problem, especially as people who take that positivistic, the scientific kind of approach. They say, hey, it's not supposed to be about me, it's not supposed to be about my values. We're just trying to understand the world as it exists and not what my opinions are on things. And so you get the positivistic scientific sort of approach says, hey, listen, we know everybody has values, but we need to set those aside when you're trying to learn the truth about how the world really operates. So as you see here, Durkheim, one of the founders of sociology, who takes this sort of scientific approach, says all preconceptions must be eradicated. In other words, that you want to leave your values out of it when you're trying to learn the reality of things. The idea that if you come into things with really strong passions and feelings and wanting things to be a certain way, that's going to color and bias what you see, and it's going to color and bias the results. And so the results will be not bias free, and won't be so close to the truth. They'll be sort of influenced and distorted by what you bring into it. So this value neutrality is what you see the positivistic, the scientific sort of folks tend to ascribe to this view that we need to set our values aside so that we can get at the truth. And that values tend to have a tendency to get in the way of the truth and to distort things. One thing that the author of the textbook here is making is that this value neutrality is kind of an ideal, because again, we're all humans, we all bring our perspectives into it, and you really can't 100% get rid of that. But it's an ideal that some researchers think that that's what we should be doing, is put it up as an ideal, even if we sometimes fall short and bring our own perspectives into it, because we're all human, that we should try our best to set those aside and let the facts take us wherever they take us. And if they take us to places we don't want to go, well, too bad. The facts are the facts, that kind of thing. And that we should have an ideal of pursuing this value neutrality so we can get at the truth, right? The other side, and you see this more often on the qualitative, this social constructivist type of approach that we've been going over today, that you're more likely to see folks on those sides, people say, hey, listen, values are a part of what we do. You can't get away from them, and why should you? And so some people will take the point of view, hey, I'm going to embrace my values. It's going to be part of my research. I'm not going to run from it. I'm not going to hide from it. I'm not going to try to minimize it. I'm going to embrace it. And so you see here that some will advocate value-laden research where, for example, somebody will say, hey, well, when I do my research, what guides me is that I have sympathy for the underdog, for underdog groups. If they're vulnerable groups, if they're less powerful groups and politically less influential, powerful groups, well, then I'm on their side, automatically, guaranteed, and that's going to guide my research. And that's my point of view. You also see here others advocate conscious partiality, which is is a lot the same sort of thing, that you have sympathy for, you're coming into your research with a particular perspective. So, I care about vulnerable groups. I want to help the powerless, the people who are at the bottom of society, for example. And that's what my values and beliefs are, is to advocate for those people. So you bring into it a perspective, a particular set of values that are going to guide your research. Now, the criticism of that is that the folks who are taking the more positivistic or scientific point of view would say, listen, if you say these are my values and they're absolutely core, then the scientific text will say that that's going to color your results, and your results will end up being less trustworthy. They're going to be, to some extent, a reflection of what you want, of what you believe in, what you want to be true. And so people are going to put less trust in your findings or your theory or your conclusions, because you're not even trying to keep your own perspectives and views and values out of it. You're embracing that. And so, in the most extreme sort of form, people would say, well, you're not really engaged in pursuit of the truth. You're really sort of engaged in producing propaganda. In other words, information that helps a particular perspective or a particular, political perspective, that sort of thing. So that would be a criticism of this kind of approach, is that then people won't trust what you're doing, because at least some people won't, because it seems like your first priority is not the truth, but your first priority is helping certain people that you want to help, right? That you're more of an advocate, as your activity is kind of more of a political one, as opposed to a search for the truth. So that's a criticism you'll get from this value-laden type of research. Okay, so you see here, all the different things we talked about are all going to have an impact on the decisions that you make and what kind of studies you do and how you go about trying to learn something about people, something that we're trying to do in the social sciences. So that's just a helpful visual there to see how stuff's connected. And of course, the final thing we'll say from this chapter is that when you're making these decisions about how you're going to do a study and which way you think is best and all that, there's a lot of practical stuff too. You have to worry about, well, how time consuming is this going to be? If I'm going to go hang out with people for 6 months, that's a lot of time, a big time commitment to go learn people inside and out by spending a lot of time with them. Do I have that kind of time to devote to learning something about these people, right? If you've seen some studies of gangs, for example, well, people go hang out with gangs and get to know them, and not only is that time consuming to spend weeks and months with folks, but it's also could be dangerous. These people are involved in criminal and violent behavior sometimes, and you could get caught up in the middle of that. So there's those kind of issues of safety and ethical considerations. There's the issue of cost. And these things cost money to do these things. How are you going to come up with the money to be able to get this research done? So a lot of practical things. There's other considerations like, well, how much do we already know about this question? If I'm interested in gangs, well, what do we already know? And I don't want to just study the same thing that's already been studied 10 times. You want to find something that's kind of new and fresh, and where you're going to fill in a gap of something that we don't really know too much about. So that's what we mean by how much prior literature exists, is how much research has already been done in this area. Where can I do something new and contribute more by looking at something that's important but hasn't been looked at too much yet? Also, there's issues of sensitivity or other practical things. What's the best way to get at the truth? If you're wanting to study something like pedophiles, for example, you're probably going to have a hard time being able to study that very well with like a survey of college students, for example, because you may not be able to identify too many people who are going to be willing to admit that they're pedophiles, and then you may be limited in the sort of good data that you could get with that kind of general approach. You may need to go to a place where convicted pedophiles are incarcerated and talk to them, folks who are currently incarcerated, or maybe people who have been released but have been part of the system, and then you could track these folks down and see if they would be willing to talk to you and do interviews about whatever it is you're interested in studying. See, so there's this question, there's what's the best way to do these things, and what's the most practical way depends on the situation and what you're trying to learn. So that's what we're getting at with some of these points here. Your research is always going to be a compromise. There's no one perfect way to do it. You have to make the best of it and make decisions based on what you're facing and all of that. So this slide here is just saying, hey, you got to be practical, and you're not going to be able to do everything in a perfect manner. So anyway, that finishes the highlighted points from this chapter. And the next we'll get into the next chapter later on.